Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. A new book examines the gang history here in our borderland region. Dr. Mike Tapia authored the book. He is an associate professor in the Criminal Justice Department at New Mexico State University. Mike, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your book. I was able to look at a little bit of your academic history, and you've studied gangs, the history of gangs and gang culture for quite some time now. What was really, the purpose and inspiration for this book in particular on our borderland region?
Oh, this book represents, I guess, like a coming home for me, a full circle experience, I guess, professionally, because I grew up in El Paso, but I left for college, back in the early 90s. Went to a school in San Antonio, and then came back around and taught at UT San Antonio, joined the Criminal Justice Department there. So I wrote a book about the barrio gangs of San Antonio. And but I had always, once I had, done that sort of work and knew, how potent the context was for El Paso, having grown up here, or, the whole region, I was, somehow trying to find a way to eventually get back and do that sort of work here. So it's been just great to be able to do that.
The book, Gangs of the Paso-Juarez Borderland, really provides a history for readers that goes back to a long time. I mean, almost 100 years. You're talking about the 1920s, where you really got in depth with the history. Can you start off and share some of that history in El Paso of what gangs look like in the 1920s?
Yeah, it's an interesting depiction. It's everything that you would imagine, in terms of like, there's some photos in the book that look like, that they would come out right out of the Little Rascals, or, it's like, but it's still sort of the same context, it's just, sort of the street corner, unsupervised, sort of, delinquent boys. And so that's one of the objectives, I guess, of writing, looking back in history, is to see how much have things changed, with the whole barrio gang context and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, so that's kind of like the spring, the takeoff point for some of that historical work, is just to look at it over time and see, of course it's changed, right? But in what ways, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, let's talk about that change a little bit. The structure of gangs has sort of evolved over the years. During the early days, can you kind of give us an understanding of how the gang structure has evolved and changed since that time?
It's hard to say, exactly how they were organized, but I think it was, just sort of happenstance. Anytime you have a high poverty context and not very many, recreational activities for kids to partake in and all that sort of thing, then it's just sort of naturally, these kids are going to naturally, I guess, gravitate towards each other when they, have nothing better to do, or, they have to make their own mischievous fun. And so, of course, it was a lot looser, I would say, the structure. And that has grown more and more sophisticated, with time, right? And so some of the later chapters, wind up at just how sophisticated we think that's become.
Now, of course, you have the connection with El Paso and Juarez, with the gangs that are involved and the relationships that they have. Can you kind of give us an understanding of how strong those relationships are, and have they weakened any over the year, or have they strengthened?
That's an interesting question, because that's a strong underlying theme in the book, is just connectivity and what those social networks are like. And the border was a lot more fluid in the era that where the book starts in the 20s, 30s. I mean, it was fluid all through, gosh, one could argue maybe like the 80s, you know? So that's a long period of time for families, networks to form. Because gangs are essentially a reflection of some part of the community, right? You know, they're kids who, you know, wayward kids who venture into delinquency. And so those networks are natural. You have, like, you know, families, crossing the border, you know, cross fronterizos, if you will, for normative purposes. You know, for visiting family, for work, for, you know, all these different reasons. The proximity is, you know, obvious. So the connections, I think, have always been there. It's hard to say whether they were stronger then or now, because now we have a highly militarized, you know, situation. Now, you know, some of those networks have been, I wouldn't say severed, you know, but maybe weakened. But, you know, that's the thing about, you know, cops and robbers, right? It's like, you know, they're both trying to always stay one step ahead of each other. And so, you know, now that federal agencies are involved in, you know, interfering with the business of gangs, you know, however you might, you know, so who knows, right, if it's stronger or weaker, but probably weaker today, I don't know.
Okay. Now, you kind of built upon a lot of testimony or personal stories from folks from many years back, and I found it interesting. You took information and that was gathered by a priest from the area, and then also some academics before you. Can you kind of give us an understanding of you know, what type of sources you used for your knowledge base to build on your book?
Yeah, you know, it just so happens that Father Harold Rahm just passed a week or two ago at the ripe old age of, you know, what, 95 or 100 years old. And he was known as El Padrecito de la Bicicleta en Segundo Barrio, right? He was just this young, energetic Jesuit priest, I believe, who took it upon himself to establish a youth gang intervention project, or, you know, street kid youth, you know, help type center, Our Lady, our Sacred Heart, I believe, and, you know, in the heart of Segundo Barrio. And so Father Rahm produced this, you know, anthropological-like record, like a memoir of all his experiences, you know. God, that was such a rich source of historical information. You know, as soon as I stumbled upon that, I was like, wow, you know, this is, so it gave me a real big boost, you know, in terms of my work. It just like, it takes you back, you know, and it's really just like this, you know, great snapshot in time for the 50s pretty much.
So how was he able to really get so much information, you know, from the youth that were involved in these gangs at that time?
Well, you know, the church is a super, you know, important institution in Chicano and Mexicano family life, and so it's a natural, you know, no matter how bad a gang boy can be, right? They seem to, well, at one time at least. I don't know how true that is today. That's worth exploring, but. You know, they tend to be very religious because of their family contexts and the emphasis on religiosity and, you know, fatalism and that sort of like worldview or mindset. So, yeah, I think it was probably not too difficult for him to break into that world.
When do you think it was really where gangs really started getting organized? Now, you mentioned, you know, the Zoot suitors of El Paso in this book, and kind of how folks started to gather together and gangs started to form. How did the Zoot suitors at that time play a role, really?
Zoot suit culture, I argue, originated in Juarez or thereabouts, right? You know, there's some like anthropological or you know, cultural you know, debate in the literature about like in cultural studies and ethnic studies, you know, about like what's the true origin. I mean, does anybody really know? Some of it has even the style of dress, you know, if and we could show a picture ahorita if that's in order, but you know, the zoot suit, the long. And so Tintan, for example, was, this caricature on the silver screen in Mexico, right? Germán Valdez, the famed Mexican actor, and he was a Juarez native. Well, at least for some part of his life, I think as a young teen he grew up here. So he like really embraced that persona with that caricature, and then or personaje, and it's like that's part of Juarez history, just somehow like a soft spot for that type of, street savvy, type of street kid or something like that, kind of a rebellious, type of figure. And so that is, just uniquely El Paso. And the book talks about, how the subculture traveled to Los Angeles, and there's always been this really tight connection between LA and El Paso. And
you bring that up, the California connection between a lot of the gangs in the Southwest and El Paso. Could you kind of touch on that a little bit and give our audience an understanding?
Yeah, in the same way that El Paso and Juarez share that kind of bicultural sister city thing. This one is the connection between LA and El Paso is similar in just that there's a familial connection, or there's a normative migration stream, a historical migration stream between the two places, for all the same reasons that people cross this frontera, right? Just familial, work, travel. I mean, curiosity, whatever. But El Paso, I would argue, having lived in Central Texas for so long and studied those gangs and those gang structures and just all the culture that surrounds it and everything, I've always argued that El Paso embodies more of the, say, Latino culture of LA or California than Texas, that's for sure. So yeah, there's just this really strong connection, and so those ties created tangible like networks wherein gangs traveled back and forth. There's archives at the UTEP special collections, oral histories and stuff that depict kind of curious kids, unsupervised kids jumping trains and stowing away freight trains to East LA and establishing their gangs there. And so the Pachuco thing just traveled with that, over time and then it just kind of became like an interchange culturally between the two places.
What are some of the most historical gangs that are the most well known in the El Paso Juarez region?
The book depicts, some of the most classic or classical, I call them. If you grow up in El Paso, talking to your producer earlier who did, he could rattle off, just by growing up in central El Paso, some of the, famed gangs. And that's, I would say that almost every southwestern city or any city where you have, Chicano gang activity or a history of that has that type of history where longtime residents just know, their household names, it's just like Del Diablo, DDT territory, over by the Free Bridge in Segundo. Los Fatherless, is one of the notorious, names, gangs that I always heard growing up. The T-Birds, the Thunderbirds, also, from the Salazar projects, and so these are typical inner city, type formations, and they just grew so large and notorious that, you can't write a book like this without giving that, its fair share of attention in terms of how they were structured. Or the T-Birds, for example, always characterized themselves as a club, as a social club, as a sports minded and sports involved, type group. But, they, as inner city culture, started to degrade and drugs started to become more prominent and stuff, a lot of them got into really hardcore drug use, the incarceration binge, that took off in the 70s, they were ensnared in a lot of that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's kind of what I wanted to talk with you about. Also was the prison street gang relationship that you talk about in the book. When did that start to really flourish? Well,
Texas prison gangs really got their start like in the 80s. And there's a historic court case that gave rise to that, and just in terms of how prisons were structured and stuff. So, but once they took place, I mean, where do they recruit from? Where do where do prison gangs come from? Inevitably they come from the streets at some point, right? Today's hardcore, teenage gang member with a reputation for violence and ruthlessness, or whatever the skill set might be that gives that kid a reputation. You build street cred, and eventually the big boys will recruit you, right? I.e. the prison gangs. So that's the basic connection, and the book talks about how those connections grow more sophisticated, how there's a real like a vetting process, and it's kind of like the elite amongst the ignoble in the street. They get to, if they so aspire, and so many gang kids do aspire to join the big leagues, if you will, at some point. So yeah, that happens, a lot of times.
What is the most, I'd say, largest gang in the region? Can you talk about that a little bit, and just how evolved it is?
Mm-hmm. Well, Barrio Azteca is a quintessentially El Paso-Juarez based gang. The book gets into, it starts to split hairs about, whether they are the same gang, the Juarez and El Paso sect. But whatever the case, that is a super gang from the El Paso region that has its roots in a lot of those, classical gangs that we were talking about earlier. Those were its first members, its founders that are, from places, some of these barrios that we mentioned earlier. And so, yeah, it's evolved into a pretty serious crime syndicate that has, I would say, maybe reformed ties or kept ties strong with Juarez drug gangs, which are a whole different, breed unto themselves in terms of their capacity for violence, right?
Now, you kind of describe that in the book. You outline the connection between certain cartels and the major gangs in the area. Can you kind of explain how that relationship is a little bit more?
Well, so a prison gang represents, like and so that's what Barrio Azteca eventually, became. In the Texas prison system, there's regional tribalism, right? San Antonio doesn't get along, historically get along with El Paso in the penitentiary. Texas Syndicate comes out of Austin, and so on, right? Throughout the state, you have these factions. Well, El Paso, felt the need at some point to compete in that market, if you will, or just in that milieu. They were being asked to take sides, and so El Paso formed Barrio Azteca, like I want to say maybe 83 to 85, and naturally, since a lot of the guys were from Juarez and they were, sort of the immigration status and, criminal alien, label and all that sort of thing was sort of handled differently, back in that era. So sometimes these guys were deported back to Mexico if they were members of Barrio Azteca, or they just moved of their own volition. I mean, when they were busted on this side of the border, they, when they got out, they went back. And so you could see like how that would, naturally, eventually they might make ties with or even join, members of the Juarez cartel. Sinaloa came in to claim a piece of the plaza, if you will, which is basically the drug corridor that, and it's a high stakes, drug trafficking, area, right? Just like Tijuana or Laredo or anywhere along the border. So that's the basic way that I think those connections formed and how that all unraveled. And so it propelled, having that kind of muscle, that kind of, connection for Barrio Azteca to have those connections to these serious Juarez-based gangs, elevated it to a level that its criminal embeddedness, if you will, far surpassed that of any other Texas prison gang. You know, they just, nobody could compete with Barrio Azteca in that regard because they had the muscle, you know, the backing of, you know, like private security groups like La Línea, and, you know, guys that are that have defected even over from law enforcement to join these gangs where the real money is, right? In drug trafficking. So that's kind of, it's just, it's a whole other world.
You also go in depth on the history of gangs in New Mexico, in Las Cruces, and Anthony. I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about that. And really, when you look at Las Cruces, I found it interesting that you go as far back as to make a connection with bands and local musicians in the area. How did you draw upon that?
You know, I think it gets back to the point that gangs, you know, means different things in different historical eras and in different places. And usually it starts out innocently enough, right? And so Las Cruces is not, you know, what you would say, it's not a big city, right? It doesn't have the history of an El Paso or LA or San Antonio. So it's a medium-sized or small city, right? You know, agriculturally based and, you know, that sort of thing. So, but it's got a high poverty, you know, a history of high poverty, and then its proximity to or being part of the borderland, you know, has some of that subculture bleed over. So yeah, there was, you know, Mesquite Street is kind of, you know, recognized even today as, you know, the heart of like sort of you know, the inner city. If Las Cruces had an inner city, it would have been there. So yeah, I interviewed folks, luckily that are still around, you know, retired old cops like Joe Bob Sellers, and really well-known, you know, folks from the city to talk about some of that history where we think that the gang thing took off in Las Cruces. But yeah, it came from, you know, sports clubs, and some of its members were like in bebop bands, and they were hot rod and you know, classic car enthusiasts, and, you know, those were their hobbies. But eventually, you know, they start to get painted as a gang, right? And so there's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there too, right? When you know, when cops start treating, you know, them like delinquents and stuff, well, they'll live up to that label too. So that's probably the best depiction of the story of Las Cruces, I guess.
What do you think it is about gang culture that perhaps the media is really portrayed inaccurately?
Yeah, it's all that normative stuff. You know, it's the fact that gangs are part and parcel of the social just the regular social fabric of any community. You know, they're your cousins, they're your neighbors. You know, they're just kids that sort of fall in with the wrong group or have had a rough, you know, childhood, or you know, less than ideal home life, or are social misfits in school some way or whatever. You know, so they actually have, when you interview folks and see their life trajectories, you notice that, you know, there's a lot of success stories there. There's a lot of folks that they grow out of it, even if they've been to prison. You know, and they come out and they start having kids and grandkids and stuff. And, you know, at some point, you know, people just join normal society, you know, or they attempt to. There's some small segment that never really makes, you know, turns the corner on that stuff. But the vast majority are going to, at some point, you know, mainstream their life to the extent possible. And that's, you know, you find that these folks have a lot of, you know, valuable human capital. You know, they have a lot of talents, and they're more intelligent than a lot of people would give them credit for. So I try to highlight, you know, that kind of neglected aspect of gang subcultures.
Now, we just have a couple minutes left, but I'd kind of like to hear a little bit more on how gangs have evolved in this region. You mentioned the street corner kind of gangs that traditionally were probably well known in many different areas. But today, has that changed? Where have the gangs gone, and how sophisticated are they today?
Right. So, you know, social media, technology, and other things that it's difficult to like put your finger on in terms of what social changes have kind of pushed them underground. You'd no longer see gangs like openly congregating on street corners. Turf means a lot less, like actual physical micro locality turf means a whole lot less today than it did, let's say 30, 40 years ago. And so it's hard to say how, to the extent to which, that really, the old ways of organizing are still, salient today. I think today it's a lot of like Facebook, social media and texting and stuff. So there's not a need to like physically congregate and, catch up that way because people are just connected in high-tech ways, So that's one quick example of how, that street corner thing has probably become less, prominent.
Is there a different way, we just have under a minute left, but is there a different way that law enforcement is really engaging gang members today compared to probably the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, it's become, even like a hyperbolized, even propagandized, type venture. There's big money in fighting crime, and even though violent crime rates are at historically low levels, our expenditures on fighting these, like insidious groups is higher than ever. So yeah, it's that's something that I also discuss in the book. Fighting gangs and crime, and has become like a really prominent industry in that regard for law enforcement. But it is what it is, and so it makes the public feel safer, I guess.
Dr. Mike Tapia, his new book is Gangs of the El Paso Borderland Region. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Anthony. It was fun.
And we want to thank you for joining us on Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.